Hi everyone, Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton here with a special issue update on Judicial Watch's Election Integrity Project. And I'm joined by our project's director, Bob Popper, a senior attorney here at Judicial Watch. Thanks for joining us again, Bob.
Thanks for having me.
Well, there's a lot going on in the area of election integrity. Judicial Watch has sent a warning shot or fired several warning shots across the bows of 5 big states about their dirty voting rolls. Tell us about that.
Well, we fired a warning shot again. We did this in 2017 and we're doing it this year. Every 2 years, the federal government issues a report based on data from the states and the counties about their voter rolls. And we can look at that report and we hire experts to analyze it and massage it and to tell us who has more registrations than citizens over the age of 18 who even could register. And we send them letters and we tell them they're not properly removing people from their voter rolls.
So let's be clear. So if they've got, let's say, 100 people in the county,
Yeah.
the concern is that the registration rolls are saying, well, you've got 110 people registered to vote.
Yeah.
That's what's happening largely?
Well, that's right. And if you're San Diego and you have, a couple of million people, it's telling you that you have 117% registered to vote. That's people who are over the age of 18 who lawfully could register. And it's an obvious indication that something's wrong.
So these in San Diego County, that means how many extra people are on the rolls that probably shouldn't be there?
About 800,000 people are on their inactive list, and those people are being processed. It's hard to say who really shouldn't be there, but it's going to be most of them.
So we focused on 5 big states, at least initially. We had California, Virginia,
Colorado, North Carolina,
and
California.
And Pennsylvania. That was the thing.
Oh, okay.
Pennsylvania. So these are not small numbers we're talking about. We're not talking about a small county in
No.
East Texas that has 10,000 people on the rolls. These are we're talking 7 figures.
We are. Now, there are 380 counties in the United States that have more registered voters than citizens over the age of 18. If we could, we'd write letters to all of them.
Wow.
And there's some, federal government, help us out. I mean, the Justice Department enforces this statute, or should be.
Well, citizens can also ask their counties, under the law, give us documents talking about your efforts to clean up the rolls.
That's correct, and we do that too.
Yeah.
We do that too. But these are, as you say, very large counties, 400,000 to up to 3 million people in these counties.
So nationally speaking, last time we checked, we found 3.5 million extra names nationally.
Inactives over 100%, yeah.
So at least 3.5 million. So that may be actually on the low side of the final number of names that should be removed that aren't.
That's correct. We didn't have data for everyone, so
Right.
That's correct.
So what's the latest figure based on the most recent data?
Well, now it's 2.5 million over 100% registration.
So in 2017, we had, we were talking about firing warning shots. We do more than fire warning shots. We
sue people.
We file lawsuits.
Yeah, we do.
And so that resulted in a big settlement, at least in California, which still has problems. But the settlement with Los Angeles County and Secretary of State of California described that the results there.
Well, what we discovered, and this applies, by the way, to all the people we're writing to a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
11 counties in California. California is its own special case because in the late 90s, they were instructed by Janet Reno's Justice Department to stop removing people in a way that I think plainly violates federal law. But they dutifully stopped 20 years ago removing people. And we discovered this in Los Angeles County, where they had 1.5 million inactive registrants on the voter rolls. And we're discovering this in other California counties. And, we're talking big numbers of registrants who probably have moved to another state. 800,000 in San Diego. A couple other California counties, we're talking 450,000, 300,000. I mean, these are a lot of people.
But in California, Los Angeles County's begun the process of removing up to, the last number I checked was 1.6, almost 1.6 million.
That's correct. And they've started that process. They've mailed to these people, and under the federal law, you track their responses or their lack of responses, you wait a statutory period, and then they can be removed.
Well, and we'll get into the legal issues as to why it's illegal. But
Yeah.
why is it important that voting rolls be clean? Because the other side will say, well, these are just names that are there, and it doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, they're inactive necessarily, and it just means that there are names that should be culled that haven't been, but it doesn't mean that there's voter fraud associated with it. Why do we need clean voting rolls?
Well, I can tell you why, but before I do that, it is federal law.
Well, beyond the legality
Well,
of it.
but for me, that's hard for me to just walk past that and ignore it, because
I hear you.
the National Voter Registration Act is the federal law that specifies you have to remove people who may have moved to other states. Okay, and that was a compromise bill. It's also known as the motor voter bill because everyone knows about the motor voter part. You register at the Department of Motor Vehicles, so more people will register, but you take extra care to make sure that the people who are on the rolls really live in the state, are dead, are eligible to vote, okay? And there's a problem with enforcing only one half of a compromise bill. It's dishonest. It's not what Congress intended. Now, the reasons why they specified that people have to be removed, consider that in Los Angeles County, 20% of the voter rolls were inactive registrants. These are people who had probably moved elsewhere.
Or died.
Yes, deaths are handled slightly differently, but yes, we found a lot of deceased registrants on the inactive list. But I mean, what you have to understand is that under federal law, they're still entitled, if they show up to the polls, to vote, to just affirm that they are who they say they are and vote. So the biggest problem you want to avoid is people showing up in the names of people who've left the state and casting their vote.
Or requesting more easily, I think more likely, requesting absentee ballots.
I think that could happen.
I mean, that would be the best way, it seems to me. I don't want to tell the clerks how to work, but they're already doing it, I suspect, which is to request absentee ballots in the names of people you know aren't around and just voting in their name.
That is a way to sort of double down on the fraud.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, in Los Angeles County, 20% of the voter rolls were people who'd probably moved elsewhere. And the people we're writing to in the last couple of weeks, numbers are up to 25%, 30% in one case, a third of the voter rolls.
So these are big. These are
registrants.
big. You know, in Virginia, it's Fairfax County, which those of you who aren't from D.C., it's the biggest county in Virginia, I think. Mecklenburg County in North Carolina.
A million people,
which is probably one of the biggest counties in North Carolina. Pennsylvania, big counties there. I think it's
Allegheny County,
and
that's
Bucks County.
1 point something million.
San Diego. Now the good news is, ironically, even though San Diego has 800,000, after the settlement with Judicial Watch by LA County, and the Secretary of State of California, as part of that settlement, told other counties, hey, look, you know, the law is the law here, and I don't know
Secretary of State agreed to do that.
Right, and San Diego removed 500,000 names.
Yeah, they're
or it began the process, or they've removed them all together.
I see removed. Now, after 2017, they had 1.3 million inactive registrants and 1.6 million active voters, if I recall correctly. Now the 1.3 is down to 800,000. It's heading in the right direction.
But it's still too many.
It is still the largest number of inactive registrants of any county in the country.
So this National Voter Registration Act, which was a left-wing effort under the Clinton administration, they wanted to use the DMV, welfare offices, places where public assistance was given to register the under-registered masses that they thought would usher in a new era of leftism.
It was a compromise bill.
And of course, Republicans
Republican
opposed
Congress.
it, and they didn't, you know, Republicans being Republicans, they're skeptical of things like that, and they're worried about voter fraud. And so the compromise was they clean up the list, that you can, look, you want to register people to vote, that's great. And certainly we all want people to exercise their franchise, but we also want to make sure that people are only voting once, and that people can be confident the voter rolls and the election administration is being competently run in a way that doesn't provide opportunities for fraud. And the left-controlled Justice Department in both Republican and Democrat administrations.
I worked there and I cannot disagree with
and they didn't want to enforce that part of the law requiring the states to take reasonable steps to clean up the rolls. Is that correct?
I would say that a large number of those who worked in the Justice Department, and perhaps of those who work there still, did not want to enforce the National Voter Registration Act.
Okay, you worked in the Obama Justice Department for how many years?
The Obama Justice Department for 5 and the Bush Justice Department for 3.
So in the Obama Justice Department, the time you were there, did they ever file any action? We know through our own efforts there were millions of extra names on the roll. States weren't doing their work.
Yeah.
Did the Obama Justice Department ever take any enforcement action to clean up the rolls as the law requires?
No.
Even
No.
And after you left, did it happen?
After that, the Trump Justice Department got involved again in that kind of enforcement. But no, there was a 10-year gap where no such lawsuits were filed, and it encompassed the entire Obama administration.
And it was only until Judicial Watch used that provision of the law that allows private parties to enforce it. We sued in Ohio and Indiana. That was the first private causes of action to try to clean up the rolls that the DOJ wasn't refusing to enforce.
Right, and now there are a couple of groups who do what we do, but we're the only group to have sued 3 states.
So we sued Ohio and Indiana. In Ohio, we came to it like in Los Angeles and California, we had a settlement with Ohio, and
Right.
the left went crazy.
Right.
What happened there?
Oh, well, it's still happening. I mean, there's still a lawsuit arising out of that, but our settlement agreement has lapsed. It's time lapsed. It was so long ago. But in that case, they agreed to conduct mailings on a schedule that we specified, and the schedule was subsequently upheld by the Supreme Court. In Kentucky, we won.
Let's go back to the
Sure.
Supreme Court upholding our settlement, because that's a big...
Well,
So
yeah,
the left-
we weren't technically litigants to that case, but they were
challenging the effect of our settlement.
right. They were challenging the interpretation that justified our settlement. Yes, and it would have affected our settlement if they had won.
So the Supreme Court validated our approach.
It not only validated our approach, it strongly validated our approach, and it made clear that the removal of voters who've moved elsewhere isn't just something the state can do if it wants to. The state has to do it. And just back to the compromise bill, the motor voter part of the bill has succeeded spectacularly. Registration rates are up nationally, I believe, 11%.
Good.
Okay. The other part has not succeeded so spectacularly. States don't like to do it. It costs money. It takes time and effort. The Justice Department typically won't enforce it or hasn't enforced it. So it's up to us to do that kind of thing. And these inactive roles, I just want to make this very clear. Our experience is that above 95% of the people on the inactive roll really have left the state. Above, and I mean, we've seen numbers 99%, we've seen numbers above 99%. So, we're talking, if I say to you there's an inactive list of 1.6 million in Los Angeles, I'm telling you that it is very, very likely that a population larger than the entire population of the state of Hawaii is no longer in California and is registered to vote there.
Still.
In Los Angeles County.
And if someone showed up to vote in their name, because California, like most of the big states in our country, doesn't have a voter ID.
Right. They would have to affirm, and that means state, that they live where they are alleged to live, and then they can vote.
Now, I understand the bureaucrats don't like doing their job, and there's a competency issue. It's election administration tends to be a backwater area of administration for localities.
There's
and
an
state.
ideological issue.
But I want to talk. There's that one thing we have. That's our initial challenge. But obviously, the left is obsessed with these issues. What's the ideological opposition to taking reasonable steps to clean up the rolls? We're not. Practically speaking, the process is. Correct me if I'm wrong. You don't vote. The state can send you a mailing and say, hey, you didn't vote. Are you still there? And if they don't hear from you and you don't vote in the next 2 federal elections, so that's
2 to 4 years.
So that could be, practically speaking, 5 to 6 years before you're removed, if you include the mailing, then they remove your name. But it doesn't mean you can't re-register and you can't vote if you could show up again.
No, registering will take about an hour.
Yeah, so it doesn't stop. But why would anyone oppose that?
Well, I think the argument that's been made, and I don't buy a word of it, okay? And just to be clear, the evidence doesn't support it, but the argument that's been made is that it suppresses registration, it suppresses somehow people who just simply aren't paying attention to their registration, and it shouldn't lapse for those people. The argument's been made that there's racial differentials in how this law impacts voters, that it impacts more groups from one race or another. None of that has been, established. The law's been upheld.
They're playing the race
repeated constitutional challenges. 3 district courts and circuit courts have upheld the laws, in the 90s. So,
well, you're a careful lawyer, and you probably won't make the conclusion that I'll draw here.
I probably won't.
You may agree with it.
Yeah.
So to me, if you've got advocacy groups lying about race to justify dirty voting rolls, you have to wonder what the real reason is. And I would suggest that when you oppose cleaning up the voter rolls, these same groups oppose voter ID, again, based on specious reasons. They oppose the idea of citizenship verification, which is a whole other ball of wax, where you've got millions of aliens in the United States, numbers of which are probably registering to vote and are able to
even gathering information on
figuring out if it's a problem. They don't even want to figure out if it's a problem.
Yeah, don't look.
And they obviously are pushing now this ballot harvesting craziness, attacking the Electoral College. I mean, to me, that's a whole group of people, the left, that's trying to set up our election system or guarantee our election system. They're able to steal elections when necessary. I mean, I don't know why would you oppose election fraud unless you benefited from it?
Well, I don't have the answer for it. I don't oppose it. I understand what you're saying, but I would just make the point that all the motivations you're talking about, and I mean, you put me under oath, okay, I believe a lot of, I understand what you're saying, but that stuff, they try to smear it to people who make these arguments like so much jam to cover the NVRA and voter registrations. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because this is already federal law, okay? And it's been upheld as constitutional. So the arguments about race-based differentials and so on really come from the voter ID arena and don't apply and don't work there.
Well,
you certainly can't extend that to the national voter registration.
Well, in Georgia, Stacey Abrams, the failed gubernatorial candidate, has famously or infamously suggested that she would have won, but for I don't think it's based on the NVRA, the motor voter bill, but for a cleanup of the voter rolls that was way overdue and perfectly within the law.
That's nonsense. It's nonsense. The margin was too big. That's just not plausible. If she can raise money from it, more power to her, but it's not true. Okay, but the kind of thing that we do when we try to clean up the voter rolls is much less controversial than the issues you're talking about. But if we are talking voter ID, minority turnout increased after the voter ID law was imposed, just as it had in Tennessee, just as it had in other states, so that argument doesn't fly on its own. But, being a lawyer and putting things in categories, I don't have to win that argument.
Right.
I do, but I don't have to.
So we've had remarkable success in the area of the law that we've been specifically pursuing on cleaning up the rolls. We set nationwide precedents, and we send warning letters to various jurisdictions, and we don't always sue, but we find they sometimes respond and say, well, we're cleaning up the rolls. Thanks for letting us know. We didn't understand what the requirements were.
That's true. And what I like is that people are coming to believe that we will sue. The first time we sent letters, we sent them to an even larger array of people, counties. And a lot of them went public with their idea that there's nothing we're going to do. We're just blowing smoke. The numbers aren't there. It's all a bluff. And then we actually sued a couple of states and prevailed. And this time around, we're not getting that kind of pushback. Now, we're in a dialogue with these counties. They tell us what they think the situation is. We work it out. We try to discuss it with them. We're in very early stages, but you will see, I guarantee you, lawsuits where Judicial Watch and individuals we represent are the plaintiffs suing the people we're writing these letters to. This is going to happen this year.
In Los Angeles County and California, it's controlled by people on the other side of the ideological aisle, and they settled with us.
Not Kentucky. Kentucky, the Secretary of State.
Well, I'm talking about California.
Oh, okay.
So
Los Angeles and California.
To me, that is certainly a significant acknowledgement that our concerns are justified when they say, okay, we're going to clean up the rolls and we'll address 1.5 million people. That our analysis of the law, they've signed on to in many respects, haven't they?
Yes, and as we were discussing, it's a suggestion that some of the more inflammatory, and outrageous arguments can't really be made when you're talking about cleaning up people who move to other states. No one thinks it's a good idea to keep them on the rolls.
So we have
if pressed.
So California, those counties still got issues.
Yes.
San Diego is most significant. You mentioned also this big Kentucky case.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a settlement. We actually had the Justice Department also actually intervene in that case.
Yes, they joined us.
Probably their most significant legal action to date.
In 10 years.
In Section 8 on that issue. Section 8 is the part of the law that requires states to take reasonable steps to clean up the rolls.
Right.
But there was a ideologically, seemingly motivated Secretary of State who didn't like the consent judgment or the effect of it that her office entered into. And so now there's a dispute about some gamesmanship there. Is that a fair way of characterizing it?
Well, how to put this? She was quoted by subordinates as saying that she didn't want them to enforce the federal judge's consent order. Now, this has been disputed by her, but it was credible enough to lead to the appointment of a special counsel who's investigating that allegation now. And the allegation goes further. The allegation against Kentucky's Secretary of State, who was lost and has since been replaced, but that was Allison Lundergan Grimes. And the allegation was that after they said we can't ignore a federal judge's court order, that through a staffer, she then sent them the message, well, slow walk it.
What was the
phrase
effect?
Was slow walk it. It's still being investigated, and any day now the investigator special counsel could come out with his report. But we also noticed, regardless of whether that's true, we just noticed that pursuant to our interpretation of this consent order, they were supposed to take certain steps before November 2018, and they didn't do them. And as a result, 150,000 registrations will have to be on the rolls of people who probably moved elsewhere for 2 more years.
So stalling it slowed the process down because of this. The federal law requires 2 federal elections to pass. And if they had done it when they had signed the consent agreement, they'd be removed 2 years sooner than otherwise.
I mean, a lawyer wouldn't say stalling it, but lawyer would say breach, but stalling it is a very good description. And we've actually asked the federal judge by motion to enforce his own order in a way that gives us 2 additional years on top of the current term. It's currently supposed to run in October of 2023. We've asked for an additional year so it runs through the next election.
So the long and short of it is that we won in Kentucky. DOJ was on our side. The Secretary of State entered into a consent agreement. She tried to game it and draw and kind of keep dirty names on the rolls longer than they should otherwise be under the agreement. And so we're now fighting to kind of get some stronger enforcement there with the federal court judge.
Yes, and our contributors should understand that just because we win one of these cases, it doesn't happen that the voter rolls are clean. You've got to monitor your agreement. You've got to make sure they live up to it, and you've got to sue if they don't, which is what we've already done.
What's remarkable as I listen to you, Bob, and as president of Judicial Watch, I often say this, that we kind of do the work that the Justice Department doesn't do. We do the heavy lifting. But this sounds to me like something the Justice Department ought to be doing all over the place. What's going on?
Well, I think that there is ideological opposition. I know there was when I was there. Now, I haven't been there in 6-7 years, but when I was there, we would regularly suggest states that we thought could be removed. I mean, I've I've testified to this in an investigation of the Justice Department from back then.
This was an IG report on race-based decision making in the Justice Department. Is that correct?
It was on ideological, pushback and interference, and categorizing people based on their perceived beliefs. So, yeah.
That's an IG
that
report
was
worth
one of
reading,
the,
by the way.
I'm sorry?
That's another IG report worth reading.
It is entertaining, certainly for me.
So there were these leftists running the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, but you would think things would change with the Trump administration. Have they?
No.
A little bit.
Yes.
A little bit.
How to put this? They became involved in this suit, and that's great. They've done at least some other work in this area in another state. But when we brought more lawsuits and sent more threat letters, still in the past 10 years than they have. And when the Justice Department has a special standing and authority to bring these lawsuits that we don't. We have to, indicate in each case why we have standing to sue. They don't. It's disappointing. The Justice Department should be doing this work. They're publicly funded. They have 30 lawyers. We don't.
Well, the Judicial Watch doesn't rely on the Justice Department. Otherwise, we'd shut up shop, right?
I guess that's right.
I want to talk a little bit more about voter ID before we go. I think one of the big misapprehensions is that most Americans are covered by voter ID. And I've done an analysis of what voter ID laws are out there. So only 10 or 11 states have strict voter ID, which is what most people would assume to be voter ID when they think about it. Is that when you show up to vote, you have to have a valid, significant piece of identification, government issued, that shows you are the person you say you are before you're allowed to vote.
Yeah.
Now, other states have much weaker forms of voter ID, which really don't prevent anyone from voting if they don't have a voter ID. Am I right on that? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you are right. In the event that you don't have your ID, there are various fail-safes, including just an affidavit where you say that you are the person you say you are.
So you're signing a paper.
Right. And if you're a person committed to committing fraud, that's a problem. I don't think that the public discussion of this issue is rational. Two things I would identify are, first, that the polls of those in favor of ID are always overwhelming, and they're always across races and across parties. And you have variation from 50 to 90%, but you always have a majority of people who think that it's a good idea. Because, as we all know, you need to, produce an ID in so many situations. To buy certain cold medicines, you need an ID, but not to vote. And people understand that doesn't make sense.
I was using my credit card the other day. Someone asked me for the ID.
Yeah.
So it's a regular transaction.
Every time I go to the airport, several times. But, that part's not rational. It's also not rational to make it about proof of fraud. In other words, the position that, to my mind, has been very well peddled to the newspapers, to the people who cover this, to the mainstream media.
The left media.
Complex. In a word, is that you don't need voter ID unless you show me that fraud is prevalent.
Now, that isn't what the courts have said, is it?
It isn't what the courts have said. The courts have said the opposite to the extent that they've ruled on the matter, and more rulings are needed. But it doesn't make sense. A state is allowed to try to make their elections look valid, and part of making your election look valid is to make people think there are no holes in the system. A hole in the system is its own disadvantage. You don't need to show that the hole was used.
Suppressing the vote oftentimes occurs when there's this perception that the system's rigged.
Yeah.
And when you strengthen the system, people are more confident that their votes will count, and they increase the participation.
That's right.
And that's the thinking of the Supreme Court in upholding voter ID.
Yes, and it's why elections should be clean. But I mean, we don't have a federal law. We should on voter ID, but we don't have one. We have a federal law on removing people who've moved to other states. And I just would, point out that under the NVRA, you can have fraud that even a voter ID wouldn't defeat. If you're in one state, you cross the border and vote where you used to live. Okay, you are who you say you are, and your ID is valid.
The ID is right.
Yeah, so NVRA can prevent fraud above and beyond what voter ID can prevent.
California, so there are 15 states, many of which are major population centers: California, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. No voter ID in any of those states. So all of these big states don't have voter ID. So there's a major gap in terms of election security in our country right now.
Yes, and it ties back to something you said, which is, why do you oppose that? What is wrong with demanding that people be who they say they are, that they produce ID to show it? Why would you fight, for example, as has been successfully done, why would you fight collecting information on non-citizens who live in various states? There was supposed to be a question on the census, on the upcoming census. It was successfully defeated on Administrative Procedure Act grounds and on, I think on invalid and poor grounds. And if you're litigating to prevent someone from asking that question, why are you doing that? I mean, I understand about the reasons why the lawsuit ultimately held it up enough that it was just abandoned. But what is your purpose? Why don't you want information? Why don't you want to know this?
Well, it suggests to me, again, the left wants to be able to steal elections when necessary. Certainly doesn't mean Republican politicians don't engage in election fraud. It doesn't mean that
they do.
The temptation for fraud doesn't affect both politicians.
It does.
But certainly lack of voter ID in areas controlled by politicians of the left tells you something, that the left benefits from it. Otherwise, they'd have stronger rules in place. And they wouldn't, the opposition to voter ID, those of you concerned about this, and I'm sure there are many people, left and right, both concerned about this, Democrat and Republican,
polls say so.
Horrified that there's no strong voter ID in the United States.
Yeah.
And so
I love talking, by the way, about this issue to people from Europe.
Oh, because they have much stronger rules.
They think I'm lying. They think I'm crazy, that it can't be like that.
Yeah, well,
you
talk to someone from Mexico.
Dip your thumb in ink if you're voting in Iraq, but in the United States, you just go in and say, "It's me. I'd like to vote."
Not to say there's not election fraud in these other countries, but these basics aren't being done here in the United States, and the left always points to other countries to point to progressive changes that ought to take place in the United States. But election integrity is not one of those issues they like to raise, because we're really behind the 8 ball on that, and behind the 8 ball in terms of, as you point out, where the American people are on that. So you should know, though, those of you listening on both the left and the right, that there's a thin blue line here. They talk about the police, but on voter ID and election integrity, there's a massive amount of groups and interests that oppose us.
Extremely well funded. Major law firms devote a lot of free time to this issue, to these kinds of issues.
Nothing can compare on our side. So there's Judicial Watch,
and Public Interest Legal Foundation,
and two. There are some local state groups, one of whom we represented, two of whom we're representing.
Right.
And that's it. Am I right?
There are a few more local groups.
Yeah, but some other
in
than
terms
a few
of having the bandwidth to be able to do the kind of lawsuits that you have to do, where you can go after 1.6 million in active registrations, that's basically us.
Yeah,
it's basically us.
But in terms of promoting and preserving and protecting voter ID, there's virtually no one other than us.
Yeah.
Our friend Hans von Spakovsky over at the Heritage Foundation does great work, but he's one guy.
Yeah.
And they do good work of exposing some voter fraud issues. And as I say, on the other side, for years it was the entire Justice Department, and you've got every leftist group that has any significant activity participates in trying to stop any efforts to make our elections cleaner. And so
And-
Judicial
and
Watch has got
the
to...
narrative in the public discourse is all one way. I mean, it's a fire hose. I will tell you that I know that I've given a good interview to the New York Times, to CBS. I'm thinking of particular reporters. When I talk to them for 40 minutes to an hour, and then they don't do an article. That's as good as I can expect. It's not like they would ever do an article that actually reported the things that I said in any sort of detail. If they can't get a hit quote from me after 40 minutes to an hour of work, you just never hear of it again.
You know, PBS used to have a catchphrase to raise support. If PBS didn't do it, who would?
If we didn't do it, yeah.
And it's really true in this circumstance. If Judicial Watch didn't do it in terms of these election integrity fights, no one would. That's
no
practically
one could.
speaking.
It costs money. I mean, it costs too much money to bring these suits. You need years worth of devotion to a lawsuit. And then when it's over, you need devotion to monitor what you did.
And that's why it traditionally has been left to the Justice Department, because it's a government, it's a law enforcement activity in many respects. And so Judicial Watch is doing the work of the Justice Department in ensuring that states follow federal law. It's
I would love their resources.
Yeah. Well, we've got great resources thanks to our supporters out there, and obviously we're able to leverage extra work out of you and your team because of your expertise. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch all the latest news from Judicial Watch.